Hello, class. This is Dr. Bradley Wolfe, and we are going over Chapter 10, Using Language Well, in the Public Speaking Project textbook. So this chapter talks about our verbal communication and the words that we use. How the words we use help describe the world around us, whatever we're presenting in our speech. And sometimes it's going to be very careful with our language choices, so our language resonates with the audience and can make our persuasive speeches more persuasive, or informative speeches more informative. But just by choosing slightly different words or different language, it can make a big difference in the impact of your presentation. So this first part here talks about the power of language, and that the language kind of frames how we see the world. So this quote here from Dale Carnegie: "Your purpose is to make your audience see what you saw, hear what you heard, feel what you felt. Relevant detail, couched in concrete, colorful language, is the best way to recreate the incident as it happened and to picture it for the audience." So again, your speeches are to bring this idea to life. It may not be an experience you had, but if you're telling a story, right? People like that storytelling genre of public speaking. We see a lot of cultures around the world. They don't like the ancient Greek form of public speaking. They really like those stories where the details are brought to life, and so so it feels like you're there, right? It feels like you're there. You're experiencing whatever they're experiencing. If you're informing the speech about baking, you feel like you're kind of in that kitchen baking with the person. If you're giving a persuasive speech about the environment, maybe you can bring to life the idea of just having, being outside in the natural environment, whatever it may be, right? You can use those vivid details to bring things to life and to tell a story. So this is both true for interpersonal communication and public speaking, right? If you're even having a conversation with someone, people like storytellers, like listening to stories. It can help, just be an engaging speaker and communicator overall. Language also has an impact on how we feel about reality. We see a lot of languages around the world use gendered language. And so it talks here, the example it gives in this textbook, the Spanish word key is gendered as feminine. So Spanish speakers defined the word key using words such as lovely, tiny, magic, whereas German word key is gendered as masculine. So German speakers defined it with adjectives like hard, jagged, and awkward. And so when we look at those gendered languages across the world, the gender of those different words frame how the people who use that language view that word, even if it's something just like a key. Is the key, kind of feminine? Is it very lovely, tiny, or is it awkward and jagged? Right. So again, looking at the language that we speak, I'm speaking English to you, you're listening to English. Maybe you speak other languages as well. And people who speak multiple language who are multilingual, what language you're using is going to change how you view what you're talking about and what you're thinking about, and how you're viewing whatever it is. Some households who are multilingual, they may jump back and forth between different languages because one language may best describe this thing and another language best describes this other thing. And so being able to use multiple languages is a huge asset. But often with public speaking, your entire audience isn't multilingual. In some cases, I've seen some very good speeches where people go back and forth between different language. I saw one speech by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs where he'd go between Hebrew and English and kind of translate what he's saying. So he liked the original Hebrew meaning of the words better, and he talked about how Hebrew has a different syntax. So it describes it. So some of the stuff is implied in the Hebrew language than in the English language is more explicit. We can also look at the Ojibwe language. And the Ojibwe language is a verb-based language. So verbs are the main things. Those actions are the main part of the sentence. Whereas in English, we're more of a noun-based language where we're focused on the subject, right? The person who's doing the action. So again, it's just different ways of framing what's being had. Even like in Ojibwe, the days of the week are verbs, right? So it's interesting how different languages view things. So communication versus language. So communication is when we're trying to transfer what's on our minds into the mind of the audience, right? In public speaking, that's what we do. Sometimes we're there to inform, sometimes we're there to persuade, sometimes we're there to entertain. But the main goal of the speaker is to communicate your thoughts to your audience. And so the language is how you're doing that, right? You're using the specific words, this system of symbols that you're using to form messages. We look at the encoding process. We encode our idea, our message, using these symbols, using the language, and the audience decodes it. You may have had some miscommunication between a friend or a loved one at some point in time where it made sense to you in your head, you communicated it, and they understood something different. And so we have to be careful about the language we use so our audience understands it the way that we're intending it. So language creates our social realities because language is culturally transmitted. We learn from our families, and kind of things are passed down through generations. So it talks about if we're growing up in a sexist culture, we're likely to hold sexist attitudes because that's the language we're using. Same with racist. If we have some racist culture, we're going to have some racist attitudes. We may not even know about them. For example, a few years ago, I learned the word gyp comes from gypsy. I've only heard it in the context of gyp. Oh, you don't want to gyp that person off. And then someone had to pull me aside to explain to me, oh no, that's kind of racial slur, right, against gypsy people, because it's a negative stereotype that gypsies rip people off, that they kind of steal. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know that, right? It was just a language that I was taught that I grew up with. I didn't even know that it had a racial meaning to it. And so sometimes we don't even know where these words come from. But if someone was a gypsy, right, comes from that ethnic group, they would likely know what that means, right? So it can be offensive to them with me not even knowing, and being completely ignorant about the issue. And so there's other words that could be sexist or could be racist that are just the words that we grew up with, the words that we knew, and we don't even know those origins. We may not even hear that unless someone calls us out on it, or they talk about calling us in too and having that conversation to challenge us to see things differently. So it's good to have people close to you in your life to be willing to challenge you, to educate you, and to help you say, hey, maybe you shouldn't phrase things that way, right? Because then I don't look as ignorant when I'm talking to other people, right? I don't say things that are unintentionally offensive. Of course, we want to avoid that in public speaking, and in public speaking, you have a diverse audience of people. You don't just have the family who you grew up with who use the same language as you, right? You may speak the same language, but you don't necessarily use it. You often will use the same words, have terms with common meaning in your family or with your close friends. But in public speaking, you have a diverse audience who have different backgrounds, even if everyone's in the same community. I'm in a rural place, right? We're all from a rural area. We're probably the same. We still have different families, and each family has its own culture, its own language, its own stories, inside jokes that people have. Those all can be different across your audience. So even if everyone looks the same, I'm a white man. If I'm giving a speech to white men in rural Minnesota, we're still going to have diversity in that group because we have diversity of experiences, in a lot of different ways that may impact how we view the language that's being spoken. So different language choices can have an impact. So it gives a couple examples here that you certainly can read through to see how the difference between these versions. So again, which words that people use to convey a message. This is a speech from Reverend Jesse Jackson about the Rainbow Coalition. So each one is, again, different. As you read through those, just see those differences, those slight changes of words, even though the meaning is the same, the intention is the same, it can have a different impact in terms of how the audience accepts the message. So constructing clear and vivid messages, right? When you're thinking through a speech, you're going to want to make sure to use words that you speak. Sometimes I'll use different words when I'm writing than when I'm speaking. And everyone does, right? We write differently than we speak. So I've had students who try and write out their speech as an essay, and it is just very choppy. It's unnatural language. It's hard to listen to, which is why I always encourage my students to speak extemporaneously, where you're using a limited use of notes, because you're going to speak as you speak, right? If you don't think through it too much, you're just going to say whatever comes naturally and use natural language for you. But if you're using, it talks about here, pulling out a thesaurus, well, I want to look smart, I'm going to use these big words. Well, that may sound unnatural, right? You need to talk in everyday language that the audience can understand. This also, you need to take into account jargon too. You may have jargon specific to your topic that the audience may not know, and you can define those terms, right? You can lay it out to them, but if you're using a bunch of abbreviations and jargon, which audience is unfamiliar with, your message isn't going to get conveyed because they don't know what you're talking about. So the example I used to work for the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, which abbreviated as MCN. If I just said MCN, that means nothing to you. Most people have no clue what I'm talking about, especially out of context. But again, for the people in that group at the organization, and people associated with the organization, they would have a better understanding. Oh, MCN, Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, right? It would make sense in that context. But you need to define those ones. It also says being more concise. Academics especially are really bad at being concise, and I make this mistake too. Sometimes I wrote a textbook chapter with my friend who's more of an English person. She's not as, she's working undergraduate degree right now, but she's more, her undergraduate was in English literature. And, so I was writing these paragraphs and giving all this detail and language, and then she'd come over and edit it and cut it in half. And I'm like, you cut it in half. You took it all this good meaning. And then I read through it and it's, oh, this says the exact same thing, right? I just used a bunch of extra words that were unnecessary. So at the beginning, I talked about, creating a picture, right? You're using the language to create a picture to bring it to life, and you want some level of detail, but you don't want to do detail for detail's sake and make it obtuse and just adding on extra words. You want to have it concise, but also detailed. So is this word adding to it, or is this just repetitive? Is this just making it longer? So some words are going to add to the texture, the meaning of what you're saying, and some words are just making it longer. And it's hard to differentiate between those two. But when you're kind of editing or maybe practicing, right? So I don't recommend writing out a speech. If you're writing a paper, you'd kind of edit it line by line, and you can make it more concise. If you're practicing your speech and you're saying, okay, I'm supposed to be 4 to 6 minutes and I'm at 6.5 minutes, what can I cut? What language in here really doesn't impact the full meaning of my speech, of what I'm trying to say? So again, trying to make things concise can be very helpful. So again, using concrete and precise language to make sure you understand one another. We talked a little bit about miscommunication here. That certainly can read through. I talked about it a bit before. So some example of misunderstanding here talks about these dogs. So if I'm just telling a story about a dog, my dog, I have a dog, Chester, and lately he's been getting into the cat box. And so we've been having to build these barriers to keep him out of the cat box. Now, if I'm saying my dog, Chester, you don't know what kind of breed Chester is. Is he a big German Shepherd that's jumping over these gates and getting into the cat box, or is he a tiny little dog that's kind of squeezing through these holes and kind of getting himself into the area where we keep our cat box? Right? You don't know, because I'm just saying a dog. Oh, it's a dog. It's named Chester. What kind of dog is Chester? What's Chester to you? A dog. Is Chester a big dog, little dog, medium-sized dog? We all would have our own meaning to that. I know Chester. Chester is a small dog, and he's a small, little, skinny Jack Russell Terrier and a Whippet mix. So he has this very skinny body, skinny legs, kind of like a miniature greyhound is a Whippet, and then the coloring of a Jack Russell Terrier. So he's very fast. He likes running around and escaping. And he's Chester Houdini. He always can find his way to wherever he wants to go, including outside of our fence on occasion, which is not good. But again, I know Chester in my mind. I have all this context and background for what Chester is, what Chester means to me. If I just say Chester, you don't know if Chester is a grandpa, is he a dog, a monkey? I mean, if I just say Chester, what's that mean to you? But we all have our own meaning for these words, and we have to make sure our audiences has the meaning conveyed to them. So using concrete and specific language instead of saying Chester, right? I should say my dog Chester, who's a Whippet and Jack Russell Terrier mix. Again, a little bit longer, but it may give you an idea. Or my dog Chester is a small little dog with long, skinny legs. Whatever makes more sense to you and the audience. I've never heard of a Whippet before having Chester, so if you told me a Whippet before that, I would have no clue what you're talking about there either. So even using more specific concrete language isn't necessarily helpful to the audience if the audience doesn't know that concrete language. So again, trying to find simple terms that you think your audience would understand. So it talks about look for words that need to be defined more clearly. So it says instead of talking about bad weather, you can say it was raining, or the hail was the size of golf balls, or there was a tornado, right? Bad weather can mean very different things. So again, being specific. And then also being precise. So the word green, okay, well, what shade of green? There's lots of different greens. So it could be called teal. It could be called olive. It could be, whatever, pea green, whatever you wanted to do. Kermit the Frog green. So again, being specific, you're adding some language to be more specific and concrete, but it helps bring the topic to life. So maybe you're seeing some examples of how, while you want to be concise, you also need to have enough language to bring it to life, and don't want to be too broad with the words you're using. I already talked a bit about jargon. So again, jargon is a specialized language of a group or profession. You're going to want to define those terms if you're using jargon in your speech, so the audience knows, what it means. Then it also talks about slang. So trying to avoid slang that some people might understand. It might be seen as informal. It may be seen as a poor choice of words, but for the topic, you may be talking about something that requires slang, and it may be jargon. Maybe a form of jargon that's slang. Oh, this is what it means for this community. But if you're just using slang, maybe specific to your age or region, subculture, or whatever it may confuse the audience if they don't share that slang or that shared meaning, or you may have to define it at the very least. Next here talks about using stylized language. So one talks about using metaphors. So they're comparisons made by speaking of one thing in terms of another. Similes are similar to metaphors and how they function. However, similes make comparison by using the word like or as, whereas metaphors don't. So it's helpful to use metaphor to convey meaning in a speech. So it gives a quote from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He talked about battered by storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. It's not literally storms and winds, but it's metaphors there to bring some things to light, to really make it more vivid and meaningful. But again, that could be confusing for some people, so you're going to want to be careful. So it gives more examples here as well from his speech. We'll get more into another part of his speech here in a minute. Alliteration. So alliteration is the repetition of initial sounds of words. So it gives your example from Emily Dickinson. The soul selects her own society. So the SSS, right? So it helps to make it memorable, right? So it makes it easier to remember. It has that alliteration. But again, it fit it naturally into your speech, right? It's gonna stand out if you're using an alliteration intentionally. Don't use it a ton throughout your speech, otherwise that gets confusing. But maybe if it's one thing you really want your audience to remember, an alliteration is a good strategy to use. Another strategy it talks about is the antithesis. It allows you to use contrasting statements to make a rhetorical point. So it talks from John F. Kennedy. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So kind of going back and forth between different perspectives. So another quote here by Terry Clark: "You're easy on the eyes, hard on the heart." So contrasting easy and hard to kind of make a point. A contrasting statement helps bring it to life and makes it more memorable. So another strategy that can be used. But again, you don't want to overuse any of these strategies or even all the strategies, right? You're going to pick and choose what makes sense for your speech. Next is parallel structure and language. So going back to Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, he kept saying, I have a dream over and over again because it uses parallel structure to get, I have a dream that this, I have a dream that that. So it makes it memorable, right? It's that repetition helps make it memorable and makes you kind of take it in. But be careful again. How it's delivered. His I Have a Dream speech wasn't just a great speech because of the words. It was also how it was delivered. So it talks about making sure you're using appropriate pauses, volume, and other elements of delivery. So the language, you can write out a speech and have it delivered in two very different ways with the exact same words. Because some of that paralanguage, that other meaning that's created through how you're delivering can make a huge impact. So keep that in mind. A lot of things to keep in mind with public speaking. This chapter focuses mostly on the words, but there's certainly other things to take into account than just having some fun or fancy words or using some of these trips and some of these tips for figuring out what language to use. Then it also says using personalized language. So you can say one might argue versus you might argue. You want to personalize it for your audience. So you have a group of people, you're really talking to them. So it says by using language that directly connects to your topic or argument to your audience, you have better chances of getting your audience to listen and be persuaded that your subject matter is serious and important to them. So it says use words like us, you, we. Can get your audience to pay attention and says, hey, we're in this together. We're here to make some change, right? You can make a difference instead of one can make a difference. And so this could impact the country in ways we have not yet imagined. This can impact your life in ways that you have not yet imagined. So again, it's really about you. It's not about just the country. That's vague terms, right? Being concrete and specific, personalized, can help connect with your audience and connect the topic with your audience. And again, you have to do other things right as well and make sure that it fits with the audience, fits with their life. Otherwise, it may seem like, oh, you don't know me, right? There's always that potential for backlash and a misapplication of these concepts as well. So it's something to be careful with. So language and ethics, it's important to be ethical about how we're using language. Talked a little bit about racist and sexist language. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. So being careful. When we're talking about topics, it's got to think about the difference between calling a specific place the projects versus calling that same place public housing. Right? Both are referring to the same space. They both have, trying to say the same thing, but again, you're calling something the projects, is going to convey very different meaning than calling it public housing. So using, again, similar words, but going to have very different meaning in the word choices that people use. When talking about immigration, one of the things that people have been using is undocumented immigrant versus illegal alien. I remember one Thanksgiving, my relative was talking about, she's like, oh yeah, these undocumented immigrants coming into the country. I mean, illegal aliens, right? She switched the word she was using to the more offensive term, because that's the message she wanted to convey, right? That's the intention she wanted, is, again, saying, oh, these are aliens, right? They don't belong here. They're not a part of this country, right? They're aliens. So, and they're here illegally, right? They're breaking the law. These aliens from outer space is kind of the intention there, are coming here breaking the law. Very different meaning, right, than undocumented immigrant. Immigrants are people who come here and they just don't have documents, right? That talks more about a convoluted system that makes it difficult to obtain documents or citizenship. So very different meanings, and depending on what you want in that context, you can change which word you're using to convey different meaning. Same with talking about the projects versus public housing. You may want to talk about the projects and have that emphasized, even though that may be seen, probably to some people, it's seen as a more offensive term than public housing, but the projects could also be hey, you're a part of this community, right? You kind of know what they're locally referred to. So that could be a thing to consider as well. So it's about, again, ethics of choosing the right words for your audience. The textbook recommends that you stay clear away from intentional bias. If we look in like politics, a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, a lot of politicians use intentionally biased language to convey their meaning. So talks about difference between pro-choice and pro-abortion, right? Again, those are different ways of saying the same thing. That someone, a woman has the right to choose, or that's being pro-abortion. That's saying, hey, abortion should be legal. Well, okay, they could be in the same thing, but they have very different meanings, right? Even though they may describe the same stance, they're very different ways of viewing that stance. So again, this is the power of language here, is the intention of this chapter to see how different these two words feel when you hear them. You may agree with one way of framing it more than the other. And that gets part of this as well. Then it talks about sexist and heterosexist language. So it talks here that back in 1746, John Kirkby said the words "they" and "their" were no longer should be used. It should be "he" and "him," because the male sex was more comprehensive than the female sex. So people used to use "they" and "their" and "them" to refer to single people who you don't know their gender. We still do in a lot of ways. Use "they." Oh yeah, they said this, they said that. Talking about another person if we don't know the person's gender. Often in verbal language, we'll use "they" and "them." In written language, people were using "he" and "him" more often. But now there's this push to say, hey, why is the male version more dominant? Shouldn't we have the gender neutral version, they and them, used? And some people even like using they and them pronouns for themselves. They say that's their pronouns. They're not, don't associate with the male gender or female gender. They just say they're they them, and that fits them best. And that's again, that's part of the changes in language we see in our society. That it used to be something that was pretty normal for people to revert to they them. We had it to some extent here, continuing, especially with verbal language, it was still used. Written language, they more emphasized he and him. Then they started writing like he or she, right? So trying to include both of them. And some people also go back and forth and will write he in this paragraph, she in this paragraph to alternate between different examples. I even know some people who use she as the dominant one and saying, I'm a woman, I'm going to write she. And that's okay, right? That's how I'm going to do when I don't know someone's gender. So there's a lot of different approaches to it. But again, it's being thoughtful about what's the impact of your language, what's the impact of your word choice, and how you're choosing to speak. Because whether or not you're making a choice, right? Even if you just always grew up saying he and him as a gender neutral term to include everyone, you're still making a choice. And that choice may have been made for you based on how you were taught to speak, how you were taught to write, but it's part of the culture and it's going to have an impact on your audience. So it talks about comparing sexist terms with gender neutral terms. So not necessarily that these are even bad, like actress. Some people refer to themselves as an actress, but it's definitely a sex driven term, whereas gender neutral could be actor, right? Actor can be a male or female. Ballerina, very common term. Some women probably refer to themselves as a ballerina. I'm not sure. Some men may refer to themselves as a ballerina too. I'm not sure. But ballet dancer is a more gender neutral one. Talks about businessmen, chairmen, firemen, fishermen. So getting rid of these mans at the end and changing them to person or firefighter. Letter carrier. Talked about my mom was a lunch lady for a long time. And she refers to herself as a lunch lady, but it could be a lunch server, right? So again, there's ways to think about the language and how the language frames what you're saying. We've got a lot of examples here that you certainly can read through in more depth, but again, the idea in this chapter is that it makes a difference, right? The language you use makes a difference. Then talks spotlighting here. So spotlighting is when you're clarifying, oh, he's a male nurse, or that's a female lawyer, saying this person's deviating from the norm. Well, women aren't normally lawyers, so that's why I have to clarify this is a female lawyer, right? Or I have to clarify that he's a male nurse because he's not a woman, right? Again, it's pointing out that they're deviating from the norm. Even though there are a growing number of men who are nurses, certainly a growing number of women who are lawyers. But again, we're spotlighting is one that's pointing out. It's again viewed as sexist language. So sometimes that's how people talk, right? So we have to understand. Again, a lot of other languages outside of English, I talked about German, I talked about Spanish, French does the same thing. Use gendered language. All the different words have a different gender to them. They're either male or female words, and that impacts many different parts of how they view things. So gendered language is very common. But again, we have to be careful about how we're using it because how is that going to impact the audience? And that's what this chapter is about, just thinking about the words we use and how it impacts the audience. Also talks here about heterosexist language. So assuming the sexual orientation of a person or a group of people. So it says here, I think using gender neutral names if you're coming up with examples like Pat and Chris, so that, Pat and Chris are a couple. Or Pat and Chris, two men, two women, a man and a woman, who knows? So it's, it recommends here just realizing that some people are not heterosexual. Sometimes, again, if you're just around heterosexual people, you're not going to know, right? Oh, there's all other people out there. But again, it's just being careful about the language we're using to not offend anyone. And again, if you say something and just correct yourself and move on is the best way to go about it. You don't have to make a whole big deal about it. Whether it's sexist language, even racist language, like when I use Chip, I got corrected. I say, thank you, right? Thanks for bringing that to my attention. And move on, right? Not something, this isn't something to shame people because it's just part of our language. It's part of how we grew up. It's part of what we've learned. So whether you said something sexist or heterosexist or racist or whatever else, it's just learning to do better, especially when public speaking, when people may have different experiences and interpret your words in a lot of different ways. So this next section is on avoiding language pitfalls. So it says refrain from using profanity in your speeches. I think this is very relevant in a college classroom that you shouldn't be using profanity. In a lot of workplaces, you probably shouldn't be using profanity. But I know there's politicians are starting to use some swear words in their speeches, and it's resonating with the audience. It makes them say, oh, look, they're more authentic, right? They're not just trying to be polished and professional. I know in the Democratic primary between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton in 2016, one of the things Bernie Sanders said that resonated with a lot of people and it caught attention. Well, I'm sick of hearing about her damn emails, right? He used that profanity in there, created a point that stood out to the audience. So profanity can be used in speeches and is used in speeches to resonate with people, but it's going to have an impact one way or another, right? It's probably not normal for the profanity to come out, so you probably want to avoid it in a college classroom. Probably want to avoid it in the workplace, but again, it depends. If you're in a more of a blue collar workplace, blue collar people swear more often. I grew up in a blue collar family, and so in a white collar workplace, you're probably not swearing. As an instructor, I probably shouldn't be swearing, but people do, and so it depends again who's your audience and what impact is that going to have? That's the thing to be careful about. It says also be careful about exaggeration. Hyperbole is a moderate exaggeration for effect and is acceptable and useful strategy, but it's not acceptable just to exaggerate the extent, because then you're starting to lose credibility, right? You want to keep your credibility and you don't want to exaggerate too much. That's both with public speaking and interpersonal conversations as well. You want to avoid exaggerating because it can be, it makes you lose credibility. So it talks about when using words like always or never, it may not be true and that can impact your credibility. So maybe use more careful or use qualifiers. And here it says, so it talks about here, don't use qualifiers, right? So giving different advice, but be careful about what you pick. So powerless language is language that communicates uncertainty. So again, here it says, always or never could be an incorrect statement, so don't use that. Then on the other hand, let me give you opposite advice. Don't use qualifiers, right? Don't use, well, maybe, possibly. I think we should. I sort of, maybe we should, right? We should be more powerful statements. We should, I believe, because those powerful statements are going to have more of an impact. So if you are using always or never, make sure it's in the context, which is actually true. So talks here about a variety of other terms about hedges. Again, that's take questions, qualifiers. So again, just not being very firm with what you're saying. If you did research, if you're trying to persuade or inform the audience, I'm the expert. I know what I'm talking about. I'm going to use firm language and saying this is what should be done in this situation. So take questions or ending a statement with "Don't you agree? Don't you think?" Rather than flatly stating that this is what you should believe. Then it goes down here for incorrect grammar. So people speak differently than they write. People do not speak with perfect grammar. So I disagree with this textbook a bit. You don't use perfect grammar. We don't talk like that, right? If you just look how you record yourself talking, they've done these experiments before where people say, "Oh yeah, grammar is important. We need to be good grammar." Okay, record yourself talking, then transcribe that recording right after having a conversation, and then go through and mark it up for proper English, right? And it's like, oh yeah, we don't use proper English. People don't speak with proper English. But you should use good grammar overall, right? Try and be credible. So I kind of disagree with that. And George W. Bush used a lot of grammatical errors in public, and people criticized for him. But again, are you conveying meaning? I'm a communication guy. Did you convey meaning? I'm not an English person where you want to have everything grammatically correct. So I kind of disagree with that. Look at the pronunciation of words, though. So it talks here about the student mispronouncing Plato, pronouncing it Plato. And if you're giving a speech on Plato and keep talking about Plato, and the audience knows it's pronounced Plato, it's going to be a little grating on the ear and difficult to listen to. So if you are going to use words or people's names, look up how to pronounce them. Now, a lot of times people use words that they learn through reading, and they don't know how to pronounce it because it's just read. So a lot of websites now add those pronunciation features so you can look it up. I'm mispronouncing sometimes. I mean, it happens. Certainly if it's words that I don't normally know or use by reading, or if it's a person's name. I know at the beginning of the semester, I always go through the names and I always mispronounce one or two. So definitely it happens, but if you're giving a speech, you can prepare in advance to know what you're going to say. So make sure you're pronouncing words correctly. Then it talks about regionalisms, our customary words or phrases used in different geographic regions. So using the word y'all has kind of happened in the South, used in Texas quite a bit. I use it here in Minnesota. I think that's fine. Pennsylvania, yins to mean a group of people. I haven't heard that one, but apparently in Pennsylvania, that's a thing. Many people in the South use the phrase Coke to mean any soft drink because Coca-Cola is headquartered in Atlanta, so they use Coke instead of pop. Or soda. I use pop here in Minnesota. Some people use soda pop. Some people use Coke. So again, a lot of different ways to kind of regions to use the same word. Or crick versus creek. My dad always says crick. He calls it crick. I go with the word creek, like it's a creek. It's a body of water. I don't know what crick is. But again, it's just different ways of saying the same thing. So again, what's going to resonate with your audience? Sometimes using these regionalisms can resonate with your audience. If you're doing a regional presentation to a regional audience, you want to say, hey, I'm one of you, and I speak the same way you do. Whereas if you're speaking to a more broad audience, they may get confused or not know what you're saying. So other language choices to consider: cliches or phrases or expressions that are, because of overuse, have lost their rhetorical power. So the early bird gets the worm, making a mountain out of a molehill. Again, trying to avoid using cliches, and create your own, use metaphors, similes, and a lot of other strategies you can use besides cliches. So kind of pick something else is what's being recommended. Then it talks about whether or not to use language central to a popular culture of a time period. So Groovy Man from the 70s, like Totally Awesome from the 80s, Word to Your Mother from the 90s. Again, are we using things you may not even know? This is just the way we talk now. It may be seen later as a language that's central to time period and gets lost over time. Again, the words we use, the language kind of shapes how we see things, and words come and go every year. There are new words added to the dictionary. In other words, kind of get just lost out of language. So overall, the chapter has discussed a variety of ways that you can use language to be a good speaker that you should consider. Again, be careful about the words you're choosing. Your language choices are intentional, are going to be perceived as intentional. They can have a lot of power to the audience in both positive and negative ways. So be very careful about what words you're choosing. It can make a big difference on an audience member in terms of remembering your presentation, forgetting it, or turning against your ideas. Right? You want to keep, in public speaking, you're trying to keep your plum on your side, show that you're a credible person, you know what you're talking about, and if you're persuading them, you want them to go along and say, hey, yeah, okay, this person knows what they're talking about. They're nice, whatever else they need to accept your persuasion. There's a quote here at the end. If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. Right? So we may understand multiple language. We may understand the meaning of what you're saying. But again, being very careful with what language you're sharing to really convince the heart of the person. And you can see here, this is gendered language by Nelson Mandela because he's using he and him instead of they, them, she, whatever else it could be. So again, it's going to have a different impact on different people. The words we're using, it makes a big difference. So I hope you found this lecture useful. Thank you for watching through, and always feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'm glad to support your success as a public speaker.